Just as I arrived at the underground bar with my date, I bumped into my brother, who was also with his date. Our private evening turned crowded. My brother didn't mind and eagerly entered the bar, ready for a party. Unfortunately, he was stopped because Paul, always carefree, didn't care about the rules. He smiled but warned the owner not to mess with him. The owner wanted to continue the standoff but relented after seeing our unfriendly looks. Inside, the music was loud, and the place was bustling. Paul, a regular, picked a booth and ordered drinks. Since we weren't familiar with each other, the conversation was awkward. Finally, Paul couldn't stand it anymore. He invited his date to the dance floor. In those days, even in bars, people only danced conservatively. But Paul danced a wild, intimate dance with his girlfriend. At first, everyone looked away disdainfully, but soon they were infected by their passion and began to imitate them. Norman, who had been watching his brother, turned to Jesse and pulled him to the dance floor. After that night, Norman and Jesse sparked a small flame of love, but Paul and his date ended up in jail. When Norman rushed to the police station, he learned that the Native American girl had been insulted again, and a drunken Paul couldn't stand it and beat the offender. Initially, Norman thought his brother was still brave and responsible, but then he was shocked. Paul not only had a drinking problem but also owed a huge gambling debt, frequently landing him in the police station. Norman couldn't believe it because, in her memory, Paul was nothing like this. Suddenly, past images flooded her mind, and Norman followed her thoughts back to when she was 7. Since their father was the town's pastor, young Norman and Paul were often forced to go to church for baptisms. While their father believed that human nature was inherently evil, one must accept God's guidance to gain virtue and strength. And God's voice comes from nature, so he often takes the brothers for walks by the Big Black Corner River during his free time. The Big Black Corner River is known by locals as the family river. Every time they come here, the father is elated, not only because he can listen to God's guidance but also because of the bountiful production of prized fish. And he happens to be a master at fly fishing. In fact, in the father's mind, fishing is as important as religion because it's a ritualistic and beautiful activity, and it also helps cultivate one's character. Moreover, if possible, the father never lets someone who can't fish catch fish, as he sees it as an insult to the fish. This seemingly absurd view was later inherited by Norman and Paul. The brothers inherited not only the knowledge of fishing from their father but also the methods and skills. The father's fishing method is the 4-beat technique, casting between the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock positions with a 4-beat rhythm. Originally, the father thought fishing was an art, and art is usually hard to learn, but he was surprised that the brothers quickly mastered the skills and fell in love with fishing. However, besides this, Norman and Paul had no other commonalities, as their personalities were completely opposite. Brother Norman is calm and sensible, almost never going against his parents' wishes. The father asked him to study writing 5 days a week, and he obediently wrote until his father was satisfied. The mother asked her to take good care of her brother, and she adjusted her pace to suit her brother's preferences. But younger brother Paul is much bolder and more rebellious. Whenever the brothers play together, she would lead Norman to mischievously pull down adults' pants. When Norman only dared to hide in the corner and secretly admire women from afar, she dared to step forward and interact with them. Facing stronger boys, Norman would first assess their strengths, and if they were evenly matched, he would strike hard, but Paul would charge in without hesitation if he disliked someone. Moreover, he dared to challenge his father's authority. Once, his father asked him to finish the oatmeal on his plate, but he didn't touch it because he didn't like it. The father thought he was wasting food and punished him by not allowing him to leave the table until he finished, but he spent the whole day there, and eventually, the father gave in first. At that time, Norman realized that Paul's strength was internal. Despite their differences, the brothers are very close. They not only go out and have fun together but also lie on the grass exchanging dreams. Norman said, "When I grow up, I want to be a pastor like my father or a professional boxer." Paul, on the other hand, wants to become a professional fly fisherman. When he found out that wasn't a real job, he reluctantly switched to wanting to be a boxer. With dreams for the future, the brothers slowly grew into adults. Needing to earn money to help the family, 16-year-old Norman started working at the Forestry Bureau, doing hard labor like logging. But because of his broad appearance and steady personality, friends often called him the pastor. Paul, being handsome and outgoing, was assigned as a lifeguard at the pool for the girls. It's well known that teenage boys are troublesome because they have restless hearts and always want to stand out. Paul, who was rebellious from a young age, is now even more flamboyant. That night, he pulled Norman to sneak out of the house through the window to go on a night drive with a group of friends. During a roadside break, he suddenly suggested they take a boat to explore the rapids. At first, everyone hesitated, knowing it was a dangerous gamble with their lives. Paul's strength quickly made Norman step up to support him, and Norman never let his brother down, so eventually, everyone carried the wooden boat to the river at dawn. But when they saw the roaring rapids, they all chickened out. Only Paul was still eager to try. Originally, Norman planned to give up too, but seeing his brother's hopeful eyes, he gritted his teeth and decided to go along. So the brothers got into the small boat. At first, the boat smoothly went downstream, but soon it drifted into a dense area of rapids. Despite their efforts to paddle and avoid obstacles, the boat was swept toward a waterfall and eventually dropped straight down. When their friends ran along the shore to the downstream, they only saw the wrecked boat overturned on the rocks. Everyone thought the brothers had an accident and ran frantically toward the boat, but then Paul suddenly appeared and pushed them into the river. It turned out to be another one of Paul's pranks. While he and his friends laughed and played in the water, Norman sat on the hillside, still shaken. Although they had done many reckless things before, this time was too much. When they dragged their dirty bodies home, their worried parents scolded them. Facing the scolding, Paul took all the blame on himself. But Norman wasn't grateful, because she thought it was Paul's fault. If it weren't for Paul, she wouldn't have been reprimanded. Yet at the same time, she hated herself for always giving in to her brother. Finally, the next morning, he couldn't hold back his anger and punched Paul, who was forcing himself to eat breakfast. Paul was strong and didn't back down. So, the two started fighting. Eventually, their mother stepped in to mediate, calming the conflict. It was the first and only time the brothers fought. Maybe they just wanted to see who was stronger. But those adolescent questions, if unanswered, fade away after a certain point. Soon, they returned to being close brothers. That day, the father and sons went fishing by the river. The breeze was gentle, the trees lush, and the sunlight made the river sparkle. They stood in a line in the river, skillfully casting their lines. Thanks to their father's 4-beat method, Norman caught a fish first, while Paul broke the rules and created a new rhythm. Now, his hands seemed alive, more agile and lively. In the end, Paul's catch slightly outdid Norman's. However, the father still had the upper hand in front of his sons. High school days quickly passed by. Norman got into college and was about to head to a city 3,000 miles away. After saying goodbye to his family, he turned and embarked on his journey. Paul followed him until the train faded into the distance, reluctant to leave. In the following 6 years, Norman spent his time in college. During that time, he rarely returned home. Paul, on the other hand, stayed nearby for college and only left after graduation to work as a journalist in the city. He still often went fishing and became known as a skilled fishing journalist. 6 years later, Norman returned home, only to find that the years of distance had strained his relationship with his parents. However, his father was as strict as ever, calling him into the study before he could catch his breath. When asked about his future career plans, even though he clearly stated he had applied for a university teaching position, his father kept questioning him. Fortunately, his mother appeared just in time to end the unpleasant conversation. After lunch, Norman drove to the newspaper where Bauer worked. At that moment, Bauer was sitting among his colleagues, speaking eloquently like a natural leader. Seeing his more mature and handsome face, Norman felt very gratified. However, after not seeing each other for years, there was a moment of awkwardness when their eyes met, but it quickly faded. Once they regained their old rapport, they went to the familiar Big Black Point to fish. Time had passed, and they were no longer young. Moreover, Norman hadn't touched a fishing rod in years. Norman's fly fishing skills had become rusty. Paul, strong and eager, tried to guide him, but it had the opposite effect. Helpless, he stepped aside, leaving Norman to rediscover his old skills. Soon, Norman's technique began to return, and he successfully caught a big fish. Meanwhile, Paul, standing upstream, was using his self-created casting method to attract red trout to the surface. The lure gracefully landed in the water, drawing beautiful arcs in the sunlight. It was then that Norman realized that during his absence, Paul had become a true fishing master. After fishing, to welcome Norman back, Paul invited all their childhood friends. Although everyone had matured and had their own social circles, when they gathered, they could still chat freely like they did years ago. Norman truly enjoyed this long-lost sense of ease and comfort. But just then, Paul suddenly left, heading to the casino, though Norman was completely unaware of this at the time. After Paul left, Norman, led by his friends, attended a lively and exciting party. It was there that she met Jesse and fell in love at first sight. Unfortunately, when she wanted to invite him to dance, fireworks started outside, and Jesse was swept away by friends eager to watch them. However, Norman was not ready to give up. The next morning, she asked her friends for Jesse's phone number and immediately called him. At first, Jesse had no recollection of her, but as she recounted the details of their interaction the previous night, he was touched by her attention to detail. So, Dane went out on a date with him. Just like that, they held hands and went to a bar. Then, they ran into Paul and his girlfriend. Although the double date wasn't perfect, Norman was happy because his relationship with Jesse deepened. It wasn't until he learned about Paul's drinking and gambling debts that he realized he didn't know his brother as well as he thought. Seeing Paul's blood-stained cuffs from a fight, Norman felt a pang of heartache. On the ride home, he offered financial help, but Paul silently refused. For a long time after, the brothers didn't have any close interactions. Even when they bumped into each other, they just exchanged distant greetings. Norman couldn't understand why Paul, always so lively, got into drinking and drugs. But now, he didn't have time to dwell on it because he had to deal with Jesse's brother, Neil. Neil claimed to be a star, thriving in Hollywood. But his vacant and manic demeanor revealed he wasn't doing well. So, He wanted Norman to go fishing with him to help change his mood. Despite disliking this flashy, boastful brother-in-law, Norman agreed for Jesse's sake. Sensing it would be a tough task, Norman sought Paul's help. It was their first real conversation since meeting in jail. However, neither mentioned the incident, as if it never happened. In the past, Norman always helped Paul, and now Paul agreed to fish with Norman the next day. But when they arrived on time, they found Neil not only late but also drunk with a prostitute. Norman was already angry, and when he found out Neil brought worms, Paul lost his temper too. In Montana, where fly fishing is revered, using worms is frowned upon. Moreover, like their father, the brothers hoped those who couldn't fish wouldn't disgrace the activity. So, when they noticed Neil hadn't followed them along the riverbed, they didn't wait or search but started fishing on their own. Yet, for some reason, the expert fly fisherman, Paul, wasn't afraid that day. Even when Norman hesitated to find Neil, she anxiously said, "We should try to help Neil. Maybe you think she doesn't like you or need your help, but I believe she would appreciate someone willing to help her." Seeing Paul smile innocently in the golden sunlight, Norman suddenly realized that although she hadn't accepted his help, she must be grateful inside. Her stubbornness and pride just wouldn't let her accept it. Norman was about to say something, but before he could, he was urged to leave because their priority was to find the missing Nia. However, when they finally found her on the hill, they discovered she was naked, sleeping with a prostitute on the grass. Both were sunburned, making it difficult to move or dress, so the brothers decided to take them back separately. Thus, Norman alone took Neil home, but as soon as they reached the door, Jesse angrily scolded him. To Jesse, no matter how outrageous Neil's actions were, it was Norman's fault for not taking care of him. Norman felt wronged but didn't argue with Jesse. Instead, he asked Jesse to drive him home. The two of them, awkward and silent, hit the road. Suddenly, the road ahead was blocked, and an already frustrated Jesse turned onto a nearby train track. It was actually an abandoned track, but Norman thought it was active, so she was terrified, barely daring to breathe. What scared her more was the track was suspended dozens of meters high, and any deviation could mean a deadly fall. Norman was pale with fear, but Jesse felt much better, especially when he saw Norman's expression. He couldn't help but smirk. Finally, after a bumpy half-hour ride, the car safely reached Norman's doorstep. As she got out, Norman couldn't help but say, "I don't like your brother, but I like you. I hope to see you again." Although Jesse didn't respond directly, he had already decided in his heart that Norman was someone worth spending his life with. That evening, Paul also returned home after a long absence. Initially, the family of four enjoyed a harmonious dinner, with Paul actively sharing interesting news to liven up the atmosphere. But everyone knew he was forcing the laughter. When their mother finally couldn't hold back and wanted to expose him, he quickly jumped up and sometimes had to leave in a rush. As Paul left, the room's air thickened. Norman really didn't know how to solve this deadlock. If someone doesn't want help, no one can help them. A week later, Neil is leaving. Though he has many bad habits, his family loves him dearly. Jesse even asked Norman to join in seeing him off at the station, just to make the big brother feel more loved. And Norman did his best to show love and care. As Neil disappeared with the train, he sincerely waved goodbye. After seeing Neil off, Norman and Jesse strolled through the lush forest. Suddenly, Jesse asked, "If Neil comes back next year, would you help him?" But after asking, he sighed. Even if you're willing to help, he probably wouldn't accept it. Neil, like Paul, would rather let his life sink into a quagmire and suffer than be a pitiful character needing rescue. Seeing Jesse's tears, Norman didn't know how to comfort him. At that moment, he changed the subject and handed Jesse a letter to read. After reading the letter, Jesse became excited. Just the morning before, Norman received an offer from the University of Chicago. She is about to become a real English professor. But she said, "I don't want to leave here because I don't want to leave you." Faced with the confession, Jesse was puzzled, then excitedly hugged Norman. They finally expressed their feelings and became a true couple. Having found love, Norman went to find Paul at the bar to share this sweetness. At first, Paul found it unbelievable because he thought a man shouldn't give up the whole pond for one fish. But when he heard Norman say Jesse is the most unique, he offered his blessings. After a few drinks, they were ready to head home, but Paul took Norman to a place called Lulu, a casino Paul often visited. Initially, Norman didn't want to go in because casinos are bottomless pits, but Paul said, "You're lucky, lend me some of it tonight." Helplessly, Norman had to compromise. Though Lulu is a somewhat famous local casino, inside it feels as serene as a tea house. The gamblers quietly play cards, with no one shouting. So when Paul had a dispute, even though it wasn't loud, it immediately drew everyone's attention. It turned out Paul owed too much money, and the boss banned him from playing. Norman, being strong, quickly dragged him out of the casino, but he refused to go home. At that moment, Norman was extremely disappointed and drove off alone. Unexpectedly, Paul ran after him. He said, "We might not get another chance to fish together, So why not invite Dad tomorrow for one last trip to Dahe? After saying this, he turned back to the casino, while Norman drove in the opposite direction. The next morning, Norman anxiously watched the clock at the table, as Paul had set the time for 6:30, but it was almost 7 and he hadn't shown up. This made Norman worry if Paul had run into trouble again. Just then, the sound of a car engine roared outside. The sound faded, and then Paul, dusty and tired, pushed the door open. Seeing his brother unharmed, Norman finally breathed a sigh of relief. Paul was as cheerful as ever, but when their parents asked him to share some interesting news as usual, he couldn't think of any. Seeing the lively atmosphere about to fade, Norman shared the news of his new job. Their parents immediately shed tears of joy, as they had spent their lives in a small town and never seen the wider world. Their only wish was for their children to fly higher and farther. Now, Norman has become a true professor, fulfilling their hopes. However, Paul's feelings were more complicated. He was genuinely happy for Norman, but also felt a sense of loss and bitterness, as they were born from the same mother and started on the same path, yet now they were worlds apart. But soon, she adjusted her mood and joined her brother by the river to fish. Yet, like last time, she didn't catch anything for a long time. Meanwhile, Norman and their father had a good catch. At first, Paul just anxiously scratched his head. Later, he couldn't resist and asked Norman for advice. Norman smiled and shared his method, then suddenly turned serious and said, "I'm planning to propose to Jessie and settle in Chicago. I hope you'll join us there. There are plenty of newspapers where you can make your mark." It was a great offer, but Paul just smiled and replied, "I'll never leave this small town." Seeing this, Norman didn't press further and returned to the shore to rest with his father, leaving Paul alone in the river casting his line. Suddenly, Paul saw a big fish and cast his lure precisely. But the fish was so large that the moment it bit, the rod bent heavily, to conquer the fish. Paul stepped into the current and fought bravely. Even as the rushing water pushed him downstream, he refused to let go. He was as wild and free as the river, never yielding, never looking back, until the rapids completely submerged him. Yet, he still held his rod high. After a tough battle, he finally caught the big fish. His brother rushed over, amazed, calling him a fishing master. Norman even took out a camera to capture the moment of Paul holding the fish with a bright smile. At that moment, Norman realized Paul didn't live by the big Blackfoot River but floated outside the city, unbound by laws and conventions, pure like a piece of art. After a brief celebration, the three of them sat together, chatting closely. However, life is never like art, and fleeting beauty can't last forever. The day before Norman was to leave for Chicago, Paul was beaten to death with a gun butt and left in a remote alley. His right hand, which he used to pursue his dreams, was broken before he died. This tragedy devastated the family. The whole family was plunged into grief, and their father turned gray overnight. Though he rarely showed his love for Paul, in his heart, Paul was perfect, no matter what others said. As time passed, the father stopped mentioning Paul until shortly before his death, when he said, "Sometimes we don't know how to help those around us, and they don't want our help. We often don't understand the people closest to us. Even so, we can still love them, because complete love doesn't need full understanding." Later, Norman reached the age of a cat and butterfly, but he still dragged his aging body to Blackfoot River to fish, because only in the valley's shadow could he return to that summer. See the Golden River, the lively line, and the young boy's smile. A River Runs Through It is a drama film directed by Robert Redford, starring Craig Sheffer and Brad Pitt, released in 1992. Norman and Paul are brothers from the same mother, but due to their opposite personalities, they took two different life paths. Steady Norman always followed the rules, got into college, became a professor, married, and had a happy family. Paul, on the other hand, is confident and flamboyant, yet rebellious. He always lived as he pleased, but his pursuits were like a void, just like the non-existent profession he dreamed of, a phantom angler. Lu Xun once said, "A tragedy is tearing beautiful things apart for people to see." Paul is handsome, with an unrestrained personality, living youthfully and passionately, like a relic standing above the river. But such a person, who should have shone brightly, fell into a filthy abyss, ultimately leading to his complete destruction. Those who loved him tried to reach out, but the prouder and more confident a person is, the less they want to show their weakness, and thus are even less likely to accept help. Perhaps, as Paul's father said, if you have such a person around you, instead of trying to help them, it's better to wholeheartedly convey your love, because what they hope for is never to be saved, but to be loved steadfastly. Actually, everyone is a river. Some may be calm, some may be turbulent with rocks along the way, but no matter what, they all eventually flow into the sea. And every step in life is like casting a. Whether you gain or not, big or small, it doesn't matter. In the grand scheme, these are tiny. If lucky, I hope the willful child never grows up, living carefree like the little prince on his planet, building his fairy tale castle that never falls, guarding his unique rose, and watching the sunset 24 times a day. That's all for today's movie. Feel free to like, comment, and share. Looking forward to our next meeting.